The inflation was in the assets, like in the stocks, in the bonds. There's a crisis of currency in the governments that control the banks.
Against the backdrop of economic turbulence, Saylor's words resonate with an intensity that shakes the very foundation of complacency, as he sheds light on the inconvenient truth that inflation is not a mere statistic, but a relentless force gnawing at the fabric of society, leaving only despair in its wake.
On the other hand, there was instantaneous, immediate inflation in another part of the economy. For example, you lowered the interest rates to zero. At one point, we saw the swap rate on the 30-year note go to 72 basis points.
In the face of economic denial, Saylor's unwavering voice emerges as a rallying cry for the disheartened and disillusioned, piercing through the cacophony of misinformation to expose the stark reality that inflation is not an abstract concept, but a malevolent beast, consuming the hopes and dreams of generations.
I think what we see is an avalanche of banking failures internationally. The extreme examples in Africa and South America and Asia, where the banks literally seal their doors, freeze your funds, and don't give them back to you. And I think we see an avalanche of currency failures all around the world.
As the masses remain ensnared in a web of financial deception, Saylor's piercing insights cut through the noise, tearing down the illusions of stability and prosperity as he unearths the hidden truth that inflation is not a benign force but a silent assassin, slowly suffocating the lifeblood of economies.
Inflation is tossed around as a colloquial term, and then oftentimes central banks would like for you to define inflation as the consumer price index. And if the CPI gets too high, they want you to define inflation as the core price index, or they come up with any number of price index.
Against the backdrop of crumbling purchasing power, Saylor's urgent message reverberates, daring individuals to confront the inconvenient truth that inflation is not a distant threat, but a sinister presence lurking in every transaction, silently eroding the value of their hard-earned wages and savings.
So the bond market had hyperinflation within minutes of these financial decisions. The asset market had hyperinflation. We had what you call a K-shaped recovery, what we affectionately call a K-shaped recovery. Main Street shut down, Wall Street recovered all within 6 weeks.
In a world of distorted narratives, Saylor's voice emerges as a clarion call for vigilance, as he shines a blinding spotlight on the darkest corners of inflation's grip.
The lesser example is, even in the US, the world's most solid, strongest fiat currency in the world today reports, what is it, like a 4.9% CPI number, in that range. And that means that the actual monetary inflation in the dollar is more than 5%.
Imploring individuals to arm themselves with knowledge and resilience in the face of an unseen enemy that threatens to dismantle their financial security.
When I look at inflation, my question is, at what rate is the currency expanding versus scarce, desirable assets? And if the cost of something scarce and desirable is going up 20% a year, the inflation rate is 20%. The inflation was in the assets, like in the stocks, in the bonds. If you look today, you see that typical house, according to the Case-Shiller Index today, is up 19.2% year over year. So if you're a first-time home buyer, the inflation rate is 19%. The formal CPI announced is 7.9%. You can pretty much create any inflation rate you want by constructing a market basket, right? A weighted basket of products or services or assets that yield you the answer. I think that, the fundamental failing of economists is first of all, they don't really have a term for asset inflation. The CPI is the lowest inflation number the government's not going to actually endorse, not the highest. Inflation in places like Argentina is 105%. Inflation everywhere in the world, in the world's strongest currency, the monetary inflation must be running 10%. In the weaker currencies, 20 to 30%. In the weakest currencies, 50 to 100%. So we have a crisis of confidence in currencies. We have a crisis of confidence in banks. And everywhere else in the world, if you want to actually access the strong currency, the dollar, you have to do it through a bank, but you can't trust the bank. And so there's a crisis of currency in the governments that control the banks, and the thought that maybe they're not all being run in a fair, equitable fashion for the people of the world. We could talk about that for a long time, but let's just start with the acknowledgement that the consensus is all of those things are losing support of the population. So if you lose confidence in the currency, the banks, then you lose confidence in fiat currency as money. And therefore the money it's obviously in Venezuela, it's obviously in Argentina, but it's everywhere in the world, even in the United States and in Western Europe. So when you lose confidence in the money, then you start thinking about commodity monies. If I can't trust the bank, if I can't move the money cross border, and if the currency is losing value every year or every month, then I start thinking about commodity monies. And so the thing everybody's been talking about is, what are the commodity monies? Is it gold? Are we going to trade oil? Are we going to move timber, soybeans? Well, what are your choices? If you want to move $10 million in gold, that's 350 pounds. So when it comes time to actually trade $10 million of gold, it's going to cost you $250,000 in insurance and shipping fees to move 350 pounds of gold. CPI normally measures not scarce assets. It normally measures the cost of generating boxed cereal, or the cost of a cheap cookie cutter apartment created with plywood, plaster, board, stamped out in 18,000 quantities. So I don't think the inflation rate is the CPI. I think right now the CPI is higher than the interest rate. So we do have a problem where on any basis your money is a negative real yield. But if I had to estimate, I would say the real inflation rate, the monetary inflation rate, is 10 to 15% a year in the dollar. The CPI inflation rate in Argentina is something like 105%, but that just means that the true inflation rate against scarce desirable assets must be 150%. So I think that everywhere in the world, you're looking at monetary inflation 10 to 15% right now, because everything's pegged to the dollar. The strongest currencies don't do any better than the dollar. And so I think your choices, you've either got something in the low teens as your inflation rate, or you've got a weaker currency and there your inflation rate is in the 20s, or you've got a weaker currency and your inflation rate is in the 40s, 50s, all the way up to 100 plus. And I think that the conclusion is, nowhere in the world is there a positive real yield. There, in Argentina was it like 90% interest rate? That's not positive real yield. There's no positive real yield in any place. There's just a question of how negative is it. And the conclusion is, you can't hold bonds. The bond index in that period since we bought Bitcoin is down 18%. Now, the problem with that is two big things. One thing is the government gets to create the market basket, and so they keep changing what's in the basket over time. So, I mean, if I said 3 years ago you should go see 10 concerts a year, and the concert tickets now cost $200 each, now it's $2,000 a year to go see concerts. Now I'm in charge of calculating inflation, so I redefine, your entertainment quota for the year to be 8 Netflix streaming concerts, and now they don't cost $2,000, they cost nothing, and there is no inflation, but you don't get your concerts, right? So the problem starts with continually changing the definition of the market basket. But in my opinion, that's not the biggest problem. The more egregious problem is the fundamental idea that assets aren't products or services. Assets can't be inflated.
What's an asset?
A house, a share of Apple stock, a bond, a Bitcoin is an asset, or a Picasso painting. So
not a consumable good, not not an apple that you can eat.
Right. If I throw away an asset, then I'm not on the hook to track the inflation rate for it. So what happens if I change the policy such that, let's take the classic example, $1 million bond at a 5% interest rate gives you $50,000 a year in risk-free income. You might retire on $50,000 a year in a low-cost jurisdiction. So the cost of Social Security or early retirement is $1 million when the interest rate is 5%. If I wanted to move $10 million of oil, that's 125,000 barrels of oil. That's $400,000 to ship the oil from New York to London. Okay, that doesn't make any sense, not to mention the fact the average person doesn't have space for 125,000 barrels of oil. You want to move, property, $10 million of property is an apartment building. How do I move an apartment building from Africa to South America to North America? That's not happening at all, right? So what about a painting? Okay, well, a painting's pretty efficient, a $10 million painting. The problem is it's physical, it's fragile, it's non-fungible, which means that it might burn, it might get soaked, it might get lost, it might get stolen. But if it doesn't get any of those things and you want to trade it to the rich counterparty in London, you're paying anywhere from $500,000 to $2 million in auction fees just to trade $10 million of money in the form of a painting. So, what do we have left, right? I mean, securities, you can't move $10 million of stocks across a border because they're trapped by the counterparty. Holding $10 million of an ETF at 50 to 100 basis points a year is going to cost you $500,000 to $1 million to store your money in securities. So now you see, what's $10 million of Bitcoin? 300 Bitcoin. So I can have 300 Bitcoin on a hardware wallet. I could, in theory, just remember it with a 12-word seed phrase. I can move it cross-border anywhere in the world. By the way, compare 300 Bitcoin as money versus a yacht. A $10 million yacht is 125 feet long, costs $2 million a year to maintain, and cost you $200,000 to move from America to Europe in about 4 weeks or 3 weeks. If you use the dollar and we trade it, it loses 7% of its value a year, except for the last 2 years when it loses 20% of its value a year. But that's the best anybody's going to get, because if you're trading in pesos or you're trading in Nigerian currency right now, these currencies are losing 50% of their value a year. And so this is the same as you're an athlete, Peter, and I bleed you a pint of blood every year, and it takes you about 4 weeks to recover. And so you don't run the marathon in the 4 weeks after I bleed you. That's like 5% inflation. But, what happens when I bleed you a pint of blood every month? Right? Now you're just getting bled to
Yeah.
I'm reminded that George Washington, because his well-meaning physicians bled him to, and they thought they were helping. The medical establishment literally thought that they were going to help bleed off the ill humors,
Yes.
but they bled him to death. And this is not complicated. If you look at a hyperinflating economy, be it Weimar Republic or Zimbabwe, or look at what's going on right now in Lebanon or Turkey or Argentina, when the currency collapses, the businesses collapse. This is the same thing as when you're in a car accident and you open an artery and you're literally bleeding out on the pavement. Well, eventually when you bleed out, your brain stops, you get a heart attack, your lungs don't work, you suffocate.
Yeah.
System collapse. You remember when Jerome Powell said our target's 2%, but we're not there? Mm-hmm. If you go around the corner, I have posted the deed to this house, sold in 1930. Okay, and the number on that deed is $100,000, 1930. And if you go on Zillow and you get the Z estimate,
is it higher than that? No.
$30,500,000.
Yeah.
So that's 92 years, 1930 or 2022. And in 92 years, we've had 305x increase in price of the house. Now, if you actually back calculate, you come to a conclusion that the inflation rate was approximately 6.5% a year, every year, for 92 years. Okay, and there's nobody in government, no conventional economist that would ever admit to an inflation rate of 7% a year in the US dollar over the last century. So I think that inflation, monetary expansion is bleeding. We just saw a country collapse, Sri Lanka, just collapsed about a month ago, literally. And the currency stops, and when the currency stops, you can't buy energy, and that, they have an edict where they say private citizens can't buy gasoline anymore. Okay, so what happens when your currency loses value? You don't have liquid energy, you can't buy food, right? You're going to starve to freeze to